Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Pichet. I'm the Director of Trade Finance at the Small Business Administration's Office of International Trade. I want to welcome everybody to the event today. We have a great event planned with the Secured Finance Network on asset-based lending. Um, I'm in charge of the field staff of export finance managers as well as the export loan programs at the SBA. And prior to joining the administration, I began my career in banking, uh, starting in asset-based lending. And I think ultimately it was that foundation of asset-based lending that put me in a position to ultimately transition my career over to the trade finance space. And taking a look at the registration for this event, we've seen a pretty diverse selection of lenders, educators, and counselors, advisors, as well as small business owners themselves. And I think this event here today is going to have something for everybody. For the lenders on the line, there's a good chance many of you are working with the SBA already. So the working capital products that we'll be discussing here today are going to serve as excellent complements for your work with the 7A and 504 programs. For those involved in the trade space, the asset-based lending space as a whole, I think this is going to be a little bit of a primer on the role of working capital for growing businesses, how it can support both domestic and international. Is again, asset-based lending really serves as the foundation for trade finance. And if you're on a credit or the relation, whether you're on credit, relationship management, or on the business development side, I think having a good understanding of working capital options, the market, the various stakeholders and associations, I think will make you that much more knowledgeable when working with businesses directly. For the educators on the line, I had the opportunity to speak at the NASBITE annual conference last week, and I focused a lot of my remarks on the importance of working capital. And for those involved in the export lending space, the trade space, the SBA is probably best known for our capital expenditure financing. That's the 7A and 504 program, largely term loan oriented. But I think it's important to understand that SBA has a great selection of working capital options, from the export working capital program that is offered by my staff to the cap line and express programs administered through the Office of Capital Access here at SBA. And the insights provided by the Secured Finance Network and our great panel of speakers today are going to help pull the veil back a little bit on the asset-based lending process, what it takes to secure these loans, and ultimately how these loans function. Finally, for the business owners on the line, I think this is another kind of example of pulling the veil back, right? It's going to be lenders speaking to the ABL industry, some of the foremost experts in the industry, giving their insights on what it takes to use these lines, obtain them, and ultimately deploy them for your business. So, with that, I really want to turn the discussion over to our colleagues at the Secured Finance Network. On the next slide here, we have an agenda I'll run through real quick. We have Rich Grumbrick and Jen Palmer, who I'll introduce here in a second. Then finally, we'll be joined by our primary panel discussion. We will be taking some questions, so please get those in through the chat. We'll be taking those at the end and presenting them to our panel. But with that being said, I want to turn it over to Rich Grumbrick and let him give his overview on the Secured Finance Network. Rich, take it away.
Dan, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. It's great to be working with the SBA on something that's really near and dear to our mission, which is putting capital to work. And we're going to take some time and talk to you about the industry and the characteristics of that industry that are relevant for this audience. And our hope is that we can continue to put forth more solutions to more small businesses. So I'll get us started. And also joining me is Jennifer Palmer, who is the president of the Trade Association. She also leads an independent lending company, J. Palmer Collective. And between the two of us, we'll get things started. Okay, so let me start with the size of the industry. Secured finance is a very large marketplace that includes a number of different products. Asset-based lending is one of them, but it's a broader ecosystem that includes other secured products like equipment finance, factoring, supply chain finance, and other forms of asset-backed securitization, all kind of tied together by a network of service providers that deliver these solutions to small and mid-sized businesses. It's a $4 trillion industry, all told, which underpins about 20% of gross domestic product and employs over 60,000 people. Nearly 1 million businesses in the US use some form of secured finance, and asset based lending makes up over $500 billion of this set of financing solutions. These products are used primarily for working capital that funds the daily operations of these businesses. And we'll go into a fair amount of detail about what those applications are and how the product is used. Jen?
Thanks, Rich. The Secured Finance Network is the leading international trade organization for the commercial finance industry. We're a nonprofit trade organization, and we're dedicated to providing working capital that helps fuel our nation's economy. Our member base is comprised of companies of various sizes and specialties. With over 280 member companies, our members range from the large multinational international banks to regional and community banks, and then to small independent lenders and finance companies, as well as service providers, including legal and accounting firms, both big and small. That equates to a community of 10,000 finance experts. Our active group works together daily, help driving our economy further with efforts that include advocacy, data, and education, just to name a few. Our members are working together to ensure that businesses, like yours perhaps, have the best financing tools to put your capital to work. Rich, back to you.
Okay. So a little more detail on asset-based lending. So I mentioned the overall size of the market. So the total amount of committed facilities is over $500 billion. Drawn lines represent about 40% of that total. And of note is that over the last dozen or so years shown here, asset-based lending has outpaced growth of C&I lending in the country. Jen?
So we'll be talking mostly about asset-based lending today, and that's a loan that looks at a business's collateral. Think about it as the assets on a balance sheet. And that means ABL can support businesses in all types of industries. For example, ABL, it's a great option for companies that have significant inventory on their balance sheet, like wholesale companies and general manufacturing. It's also an excellent tool for specialized companies like retail, oil and gas, and automotive companies who may have unique equipment or real estate on their balance sheet. And it also works well for service companies who may simply just have AR. No matter what the industry, ABL can help provide the working capital a business needs to help grow and thrive. Thanks, Rich.
So the next page here gives you a sense of the performance of this asset class over many cycles. So it's categorized by low loss given default, and that's thanks to the collateral that is the basis for these loans. And when you look at the charge-offs or defaults relative to C&I lending, it's about half of C&I lending. And it's also notable that over the 30 years that we show on the bottom chart, through all kinds of economic cycles, the high water point for charge-offs in the industry is still only about 1%. And in the last few years, it's been just basis points of losses. So it's a very high performing asset class, and that has a lot to do with the close interaction between the lenders and their borrowers. And we'll talk more about that. And to get into more discussion about how asset-based lending works, I'll introduce the moderator of our panel, Larry Flick, with the firm Blank Rome. And Larry, you could introduce the rest of your panel.
Sure. Blank Rome is a law firm. I run our finance practice. We have 14 offices and 700 lawyers across the country. I'm based in New York, and I spend all of my time representing banks and non-bank lenders in structuring and documenting and working out and sometimes liquidating or taking a company through bankruptcy in asset-based lending transactions. So our panel today is a great panel. We have Yvonne Kinsner is Senior Vice President of Cambridge Savings Bank. Yvonne founded the ABL Group at Cambridge in 2019, and she has over 20 years experience in asset-based lending. We have Don Clark. Don has been involved in asset-based lending for over 35 years. For the last 30 years, he's been the president of Asset-Based Lending Consultants, which is a leading consulting firm to the asset-based lending industry. They provide training for people. He's taught over 5,000 people in the industry. They provide monitoring services, and they provide field exams, which are an important part of asset-based lending, and we'll talk about that. Our last panelist is Stephen Gold. Stephen has been in the industry for over 30 years. He's the president of Allied Financial Corporation, and they are a working capital lender and account receivable lender that focuses on transactions 25,000 to 2 million. I think, Steve, is your sweet spot. So we've got a great panel. We cover a number of different segments in the industry. All four of us have been very active for many, many years with the Secured Finance Network and its predecessor, the Commercial Finance Association. It's an incredible organization that has helped educate us, and we've helped educate others in the industry. And it's an organization that allows all of us to network with our peers and continue to learn and grow and provide service to the industry. So with that, I'm going to just take a very rudimentary sort of primer on asset-based lending and just talk about the general structure. So first, asset-based lending has been around for a long time. I Googled and I found some stuff. For over 4,000 years, there has been asset-based lending. The earliest example I could find was financing of grain on ships, I guess going up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Syria, Iraq, what is now Syria and Iraq. So it's been around for a long time. It's been prominent in the U.S. For some time. So compared to a C&I or cash flow loan, where you're underwriting it primarily based on the borrower's financial ability to repay and perhaps the enterprise value of the company if it were to be sold, multiples of EBITDA. Asset-based lenders look at that, and some of them may also underwrite to those criteria. But asset-based lenders look at the assets on a company's balance sheet, and they try to lend against them and value them and lend an amount of money that equal to what they believe the assets would bring in a liquidation if they had to do that. So they're really looking at asset values, and not necessarily, they certainly want to have the company be able to repay and cover interest charges, but they're really looking at the value of the collateral and structuring their transaction to lend against that and to have the amount of their loan go up or down depending on changes in the collateral and the value of the collateral. So the structure and the documentation looks like any other C&I loan. You have a loan agreement or a credit agreement. You may have a standalone security agreement, or the security provisions may be baked into the credit agreement. You may have guarantees and side agreements. You have other secured loans in the capital structure. You may have a junior lender. There may be an SBA loan. In addition to a working capital loan, you would have an intercreditor agreement or a subordination agreement. So all of the documentation looks the same. And so in structuring an asset-based lending transaction, you want your borrowers to be the entities that own the collateral and the entities that are receiving the funds. So types of collateral for an asset-based lending, many of the transactions are all asset. Some specialized forms of asset-based lending. You have revolving credit facilities, working capital, or acquisition financing. You also have account receivable, factoring, both recourse and non-recourse. You have purchase order financing. You have floor plan financing inventory on a dealer's showroom lot. You have specialized financing for various vendors and reverse factoring and things like that. So we're going to focus today on working capital financing, a revolving credit facility, and how an asset-based lender structures that and what they lend against. So primarily, the two categories of collateral that most working capital loans will include are accounts receivable and inventory. You also see in some cases in a borrowing base, and we'll get to the borrowing base, or as additional collateral. These are secured by all of the assets of the company, not always. But I've had transactions where equipment is in the borrowing base, where there's a term loan secured by a percentage of the appraised value of the equipment, and that it amortizes, or the borrowing base amount amortizes down. IP, the value of a company's IP, and sometimes even real estate, and sometimes cash that's on the balance sheet and held in accounts can be included in the borrowing base. So those are the primary types of collateral that asset-based lenders are lending against. The way they structure the transaction is there's a borrowing base, there's a line limit or a cap on the amount of loans. So, maybe let's say it's a $50 million revolver, but the borrower can borrow up to the greater of the line cap, the 50 million, or the amount of the borrowing base. So the borrowing base is an amount that is determined by taking the company's eligible collateral, and we'll talk about what goes into that, and multiplying it by an advance rate that the lender has come up with for various types of collateral. The advance rate might be for accounts receivable 80 to 85%, but the lender will look at the dilution on a particular company's receivables, and they may have a higher advance rate for account debtors, customers that are more creditworthy. So you might see, some account debtors or some customers have a higher advance rate, 90%, 85%, whereas others have a lower percentage. And the lender is making those determinations based on its belief as to what they would recover if the company, if they were liquidating those receivables and collecting them out. On inventory, the advance rate is usually a percentage, might be 50%, it might be higher. And it's usually the lesser of that percentage or another percentage of the appraised net orderly liquidation value of those eligible receivables. And it's usually the percentage is the lower of cost or market, so whatever that is. So they take those percentages, they multiply them by the various categories. You often see sublimits in these for inventory. There may be a sublimit that's a dollar figure in a $50 million facility. Maybe there's an inventory sublimit of 15 million, 20 million. Sometimes the sublimit is a percentage that the inventory advances can't be more than a percentage of the advances against accounts receivable. So you look at the eligibility, you do that math, and then if the collateral, when you multiply those advance rates against the eligible collateral, were 40 million, that customer would be able to at any time borrow up to the 40 million of their $50 million facility. But as their accounts receivable and inventory grew, they could get up to the 50 million. And you do have situations where the company has a line, but their borrowing base is actually higher than their line and they have suppressed availability. Maybe they don't need that extra availability and don't want to pay for the commitment. So you do see that from time to time. So eligibility is important, and in every asset-based loan agreement, there is a definition of eligible inventory, eligible accounts. There might be a definition of eligible equipment, and every credit is different because every borrower in every industry is different. So what might be eligible in one transaction might not be eligible in another transaction. And so this is all dependent on how the lender is underwriting and the type of business. So some basic eligibility requirements for inventory. Some transactions, the lender's only lending on finished goods. In other transactions, they may be lending against work in process WIP. And in some cases, they may be lending against packaging and raw materials. And it really depends on the industry and the lender's belief that they would be able to, if they were lending against WIP, finish the WIP and turn it into something valuable that they would be able to sell and liquidate. With raw materials, it might depend on the lender's view of whether those raw materials have any value and they can be sold independently. Certainly, if the raw materials are commodities and they have their own value, that those might be included, but it depends. So the lender probably is going to require that eligible inventory not be obsolete, slow-moving, or unmerchantable. They're certainly going to require that they have a first lien perfected security interest in that inventory, and probably that it's not subject to any other security interest. They may allow permitted liens on other assets, but usually not on their inventory unless they have an intercreditor and subordination on that. So they may or may not lend against consigned inventory. There's nothing wrong with lending against consigned inventory, but it would take some additional legal steps to perfect and make sure that the lender was properly perfected and had first priority in consigned inventory. In some cases, they may exclude inventory that is trademarked, subject to a license agreement. Other transactions, all of the inventory is subject to a license agreement, and they make that eligible. And that just means that we as lawyers have to look at the licenses and evaluate it, and in many cases get consents from the licensor. Good example of a transaction like that is maybe a company that makes sweatshirts, and they have all of their product is licensed from companies like Disney, and their licenses don't allow them to sell after the license is terminated or unless they pay royalties. So there's a lot of diligence that goes into both on the business side and the legal side in determining what the eligibility criteria should be. But those are just some examples. Maybe in-transit inventory is eligible, maybe it's not. There's nothing wrong with lending against in-transit inventory, but again, it requires us to look at things, look at how the transaction is structured, and maybe get some third-party documents to make that eligible. Government contracts, if the government is an account debtor, maybe that's eligible, but again, it takes some special things. So eligible receivables. They're receivables that are due and owing for the sale of goods or the provision of services that have occurred. To be eligible, they usually have to be within an aging, typically 90 days from the invoice date or the due date. But you oftentimes see differences in that. Healthcare transactions, for example, if a lot of the receivables are due from a state under Medicaid, the eligibility may be longer because the time period is longer. If a particular ABL borrower has extended terms, maybe those are eligible, but maybe there's a cap on that. So every transaction is different. Cross-aging provisions, eligibility on accounts receivable is often subject to a cross age. If a more than X percent, usually 50% of a customer's accounts receivable have aged out and are past that 90-day period, then all of them are ineligible. Why is that? Well, if the ones that should have been paid within 90 days aren't being paid, then something's wrong, and the lender wants to look at that and determine why, and is questioning whether any of them are should be eligible. So those are some of the typical eligibility requirements for accounts. Again, that it's subject to the lender's first and only priorities, senior first lien priority. You don't want accounts receivable that are on a bill and hold transaction, a guaranteed sale, sale and return, sale and approval, anything that gives the customer the right to return the inventory and basically cancel the account. You may have sublimits for different customers. You may have concentration limits. Maybe the concentration limits are higher for certain. So that's eligibility in the borrowing base. So looking at that, reserves, again, asset-based lender is looking at this as if they might have to step in and sell and liquidate their collateral in an Article 9 sale or in a distressed transaction. Example of a reserve that the lender might put in is if they have a lot of inventory at a location where they can't get a landlord waiver, they can't get the landlord to agree that they don't have a lien for the inventory stored on their premises for their unpaid rent. They might want to put a landlord reserve in, usually 3 months, so they know they have some money set aside to pay the landlord. There are other things that they put reserves in. Another standard provision in asset-based loan transactions is cash dominion. And they may have this. It may be springing dominion, where if the fixed charge covenant or leverage or liquidity goes below a certain level, then they spring dominion, and before that they don't. But most asset-based working capital transactions, all of the proceeds of accounts receivable go into an account that is in the lender's control, either if it's a bank lender at the bank or at another financial institution where they have a deposit control agreement to make sure that they're perfected in the proceeds in the account, usually swept daily and then relent, based on an update to the borrowing base. So reporting, obviously, asset-based lenders want to get daily, weekly, monthly, depending on the transaction, reporting on accounts receivable and ineligibles. In some transactions, they'll get daily reporting of new accounts receivable, but they'll only update the ineligibles on a monthly basis. So the other thing that factors in most asset-based lending transaction is almost always they'll have a field exam prior to closing a transaction or shortly after closing if it's a new acquisition. And they may have ongoing field exams twice a year, 3 times a year, depending on the credit and how it's rated. And they have appraisals. They may have appraisals going in on inventory. And if they're lending against equipment, real estate, IP, they may have appraisals on those and the right to update those appraisals periodically. So that's the basic structure of asset-based lending. And now we're going to turn to our panelists. We're going to talk a little bit about some specific transactions and what they see.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that primer. I think it was really helpful. Just want to stress again that we're really talking about working capital revolving lines of credit for this ABL panel. But as mentioned, there are lots of other assets that could go into an ABL deal. But really, it's sort of just think about it as inventory is sold, gets converted to accounts receivable gets collected, turns into cash. That cash gets swept against the outstanding loan, and the whole process repeats. So we are constantly looking and trying to understand that cash to cash cycle. How quickly is inventory turning over? How collectible is that accounts receivable? And absolutely in the underwriting process, we are focusing a lot on understanding that, as well as looking at projections and trying to predict how that borrowing base will flex up and down based on seasonality and based on other things that the business is planning, and having enough cushion or availability for things that they don't foresee. We never want a borrower to always be what we call bumped up completely against their line and be fully extended, fully borrowed. And then if there's something like COVID with supply chain issues, then they're stuck and they don't really have a checkbook anymore that they can go to. So I think one of the reasons why ABL has such a great track record in terms of low to almost no losses is all of this monitoring that we're about to talk about. And critical to that in the due diligence and underwriting process is, as mentioned, the field exam. The field exam, you can, some people refer to it as, oh, it's an audit. It's really not an audit. It is focused on those two main pieces of collateral, the inventory and accounts receivable, but also looking at cash and its controls, looking at accounts payable and their vendors. And I think it would be great, Dawn, if you jumped in now and just spoke to us a bit about how your firm handles field exams in the initial underwriting process. And then in a little bit, we'll talk about once a deal closes and ongoing field exams and how that might differ.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, so we actually do send analysts into the field. They go out and view the premises, look at operations, speak to people, and review books and records. And the intent is to do a qualitative and quantitative analysis on both receivables, in particular in inventory, to determine what collateral should be eligible. And again, I think Larry mentioned the fact that we think liquidation scenario. We do think liquidation scenario. Can I get my money back? If the company folds up, the guy's off in Jamaica having a fun time, and we're stuck in Milwaukee in the middle of winter trying to collect receivables and sell the inventory. So the advance rates serve the purpose that we established, serve the purpose of giving us an exit strategy to get our money back. We actually send people out, they look at books and records. And receivables, for example, we do a 24-month statistical look. It's data-driven. We look to see what dilution is. And dilution is on non-cash reduction to receivables. We try to determine how much of the receivables would be collectible in a liquidation scenario, as I said before. And we actually come up with that. And dilution, if you read my book called Asset-Based Lending Disciplines, it's on Amazon. It talks about dilution being the engine that drives the advance rate. We look at inventory, again, to make sure that the inventory can be sold. If you talk to most lenders, they'll tell you it's 50%. And you ask them, why is it 50%? And they say, well, it sounds good. No, we actually go through a process of coming up with these advance rates to make sure that, again, we can recover our money in a liquidation scenario. So the field examination from where I sit and what we do on a global basis is we are integral to. We are, to me, the genesis of the underwriting process, where we go out and help establish what the advance rates are, what the carve-outs for ineligibles are, what the parameters should be, so that we can structure a loan that makes sense and allows us to get out if we have to. That's what the new business survey does. Yvonne?
Thank you, Don. That's really helpful. Another piece that we sometimes will go out and use a third party for is an inventory appraisal. Personally, I like getting appraisals for every piece of the consumer product inventory we might touch, whether that's a retailer or a wholesaler. There's been just a lot of movement in that sector, and I think it's very important to get the folks who actually liquidate that inventory to look at this for a bank lender and say, yes, the controls might be in place and the costing is correct and the inventory perpetual is accurate and can be relied upon, but can you sell it, as Don mentioned, in a quick scenario where we say the music has stopped and we need to liquidate this company? I want to take a step back and say, as a bank, and certainly at Cambridge Savings Bank, our intent is never to liquidate these companies that we're lending to. We want to help them grow and gain as much working capital as possible. But again, the whole thing with ABL is looking at it in the worst case scenario, which for us is liquidation, and structuring the deal right up front so that we know we could get out of the deal if we had to by liquidating. Generally, what will happen is it will get refinanced in my scenario with a non-bank lender, which we'll get Stephen's perspective in a moment. But in any case, we need to understand, what should we not be lending upon, because in a liquidation, it would be problematic. So in underwriting, that is really what we're trying to get our arms around. And of course, as part of the closing, once we get the field exam completed and hopefully no surprises have occurred, we get the inventory appraisal, which helps us understand liquidation value. We put that all together, come up with a borrowing base, share it with the borrower, and in some instances, they need to report daily. In other instances, it's less frequently. Weekly is the more common cadence in terms of how often do you need to report. But this concept that we touched upon of cash dominion is very important to understand. And what that is all cash receipts go into a blocked account, and that account is swept against the loan every evening. So all cash coming in is used to pay down the loan. When they pay down the loan, in our collateral monitoring system, we also take collateral and reduce the collateral. So now their checkbook, if you will, just was reduced. So how do you increase that checkbook? You need to report. You need to send in a borrowing base, show us your refreshed accounts receivable, show us your new inventory. We will do a reconciliation, and we will increase the collateral that you have and increase your borrowing power. So cash dominion is a very important piece to asset-based lending. And again, for asset-based lending, all accounts need to be with the bank that's providing the working capital revolver. And for us, we always need an all asset lien, and we need to file those UCCs when we get into legal documentation. That's another linchpin of ABL, is having a blanket lien on all assets, even though we're just focused on the working capital current assets. But then you move to post-close, and again, we touched on reporting. There's obviously financial statements that always need to be reported on a monthly basis, but really we're focused on the borrowing base. Does it need to be daily? Does it need to be weekly? And how accurate is this borrowing base? I already mentioned the daily sweep and its impact to availability. And another item that is common in ABL is we conduct these field exams on an ongoing basis. It's not just upfront in underwriting.
Right.
It's important for me to get firms like Don's out there at least every 6 months. And if performance starts to deteriorate, we actually will increase that cadence to every 3 months, which is a lot of work for the company's part, a lot of work on our part as well in understanding what's going on. But again, that's what's critical in ABL, because it's current assets that are flipping over quickly. It's very important to understand, did they just sell all of their best product and now I'm left with the worst stuff that won't sell very well? Or, for my receivables, they might have a large total accounts receivable, but is it all aged out? Or is there a lot of non-cash items that is reducing the collectability of that AR? Very important to understand. I just had a recent example where everything was fine in underwriting. Everything was fine for the first year. We just finished a field exam, and the examiner called us and said, geez, we just saw a huge amount of pre-billing that's going on. So billing for product that hasn't been delivered yet. Big problem, because if we go to actually collect on receivables where the customer hasn't received their goods, obviously they'll say, I'm not paying you until I get my goods. So why is this happening? How will we deal with it in the borrowing base? That's exactly why we do ongoing field exams. And Don, are they any different for you when you go back in, let's say 6 months later after your initial exam?
No, yeah, no. So initially, so we go back in to reconfirm that nothing has changed, either qualitatively or quantitatively. We go back in to take another look at dilution again to make sure the advance rates that we agreed to is still the same. There's no further erosion. To look to make sure the client, receivables are still, strong. I mean, new customers any kind of cash diversion, any changes in inventory. We're actually doing a full review both vertically and horizontally every time we go out to look. And if there's our over advances, we want to find out why. And not just to look at the collateral, Yvonne, but we also look at the books and records in general, financial statements, accounts payable, taxes, to make sure people are paying their payroll taxes. Because we know the federal government can prime the lender if he doesn't pay his taxes. So we do more than just look at the collateral in the repeat examination. We actually test other areas.
Great, thank you. And then, yeah, usually our deals are about 3 years in tenor. And if all goes well, what we hope will happen is they will just extend with the bank and have another 3-year deal tacked at the end of it. Actually, the best case scenario is if performance increases so much and they are reporting a lot of bottom line net income that they actually qualify to go into what we call middle market / the cash flow area within the bank, which is less stringent reporting, maybe a monthly borrowing base or maybe no borrowing base. So that's another scenario. If performance has deteriorated a bit, we might actually give a call to someone like Steve, who's on our panel, and say, hey, you're a non-bank finance company. They're no longer bankable, but we want to help them. Is this a transaction that you would take on? And worst case scenario would be default and bankruptcy and full liquidation. But honestly, that really has only happened maybe twice in my career when I'm doing bank ABL. If you have your eye on the ball and are continuing with this due diligence, unless there's just something that happens that's unforeseen, that usually is not the case. But what I would like to focus on now is just transferring this to Steve and just say, if you can give us some examples of transactions. And again, this is a non-bank finance company.
Great. Terrific. Yvonne, that was a great outlook and perspective from the bank's viewpoint. As a non-bank perspective, I thought I'd take the time and answer 2 questions. First question being, how do non-banks complement banks? Because there's a big difference, and Yvonne did a nice job of laying it all out. But as a non-bank, first off, non-banks are not regulated. So we can react extremely quickly. And when dealing with small business owners who, of course, wear many hats, we're often asked to work under a very short time frame. We don't love that, but that's what we have to do. More important, we can act with a true entrepreneurial spirit, meaning we can look beyond the numbers. And again, in the description that Yvonne provided, when companies deteriorate or they have not reached a certain maturity level, the numbers don't always look great, so we have to look beyond that. Most lenders will say that they listen to the story of the business owners, but the story is truly a factor that weighs heavily in our decision process. So we zero in on the owners. We look at their experience and their expertise in their respective industry. And we must believe in their ability to build their company the way their projections lay out, or to some extent, or to be able to turn the company around if we got the company when it was in a distressed situation. So we're really, as a non-bank lender, we're the perfect complement for banks. When the credit does not meet the bank's lending criteria, because we can provide the working capital line of credit piece while the bank can maintain the remainder of the relationship, which is probably what they'd love to have happen. So that's how we would complement them. The second thing that we look at, or we want to talk about, is why is this relevant in an economic why is this relevant in any economic environment, but in particular, even more so in today's economic environment? Our area as non-bank asset-based lenders will always prevail and have opportunities in good economic times as well as bad. The reason being, banks will always have a smaller or a more conservative credit box, regardless of the economic conditions. That being said, when our economy faces volatility, just as we have experienced over the past year or so with high inflation and fears of recession, the banks naturally tighten their credit criteria. Now, throw in the mix the recent events of last month with bank failures, and you really have the trifecta. So bank regulations will only become more restrictive, and regulators will step up their intensity on their reviews. And when it comes to asset-based lending, what sets non-bank lenders apart is our thorough but not intrusive monitoring approach. And it's been talked about, mentioned by Larry as well as Yvonne and Don. So that's what we are really focused on, is a thorough monitoring approach. Our expertise and sole focus are to monitor our credits on a daily basis. So when it gets down to the non-bank lenders, I think we have to get even more granular. Understanding and tracking the trends and the analysis of each of our borrowers is critical to the success of the lending relationship. This is what enables our industry to be able to be successfully provide financing to companies that were turned down by traditional banks for very legitimate reasons. Reasons such as startup companies, which we've seen a lot of the past couple of years since the Great Resignation. Companies that are highly leveraged, companies showing losses, whether the losses be due to unforeseen circumstances or what we're seeing a good bit of today is they're showing losses because they lost their income from the quote unquote PPP funds. So now the true income state results are being revealed. High concentration, that was mentioned earlier, concentration limits, but they may violate a covenant of a concentration limit with their lender, so they would come to us. Or poor personal credit. Most of us will take personal guarantees, so personal credit is something that banks will look at, and obviously, as many of you on this call know, that could be a reason to disqualify the borrower or the prospect from a traditional line. These become scenarios for where a monitored line of credit can be the perfect option and yield optimum results. So what I want to do is just offer two recent case studies, deals that we did within the last 60 days, which I think are always a good way to give everybody an idea of to what exactly are we talking about here. So the first referral that we received just recently in mid-February was from one of our bank referral partners. The company that they referred to us lays fiber optic cable. The challenges that we were faced with and why it came to us, this was a startup company. And I mean startup literally from day one. The owners hadn't even resigned from their current position at their company until they had the working capital line of credit approved, which was smart on their part, but also shows how early stage this really was. They were projecting extreme growth, part and parcel due to the passing of the new infrastructure bill, which calls for better internet access in rural areas, which was creating a tremendous demand. They had a concentration of only 2 customers. They have milestone billing, and they wanted to have the line of credit in place by the end of the month when we met them, which basically gave us 15 days to have this done from the day we met them to being able to fund them. The owners requested a $400,000 line of credit, but as we told them, based upon their anticipated high growth, which they had laid out very nicely to us, we are and we're prepared to increase the line of credit as the revenue grows. We approved the deal, and this is that entrepreneurial spirit. We approved the deal at the meeting. At the very first meeting, the first time we shook hands, we said, yes, we could do the deal. This is how we're going to structure it. And they had a proposal letter from us the next day, which outlined everything we had agreed to. And as timely as this scenario is, and us thinking that the $400,000 was never enough, I kid you all not, this morning they called and said, wow, this is great, but we think we need more money. So they've asked us to go to a $750,000 line of credit, which we approved for them right away. We would have approved that for them from the get-go because we thought they needed it. But we've approved that for them, and we'll have the documents drafted and signed ASAP. The second example is a referral that also came from a close banking referral relationship, And this was really sensitive. This is a long-standing bank relationship, bank customer relationship. And when I say long-standing, I mean decades long. There were a lot of challenges to overcome on this deal. This was a contractor, which is a difficult industry for most lenders. And in this case, this was a bank workout. It had gone to special assets, which is, as I said, this is a delicate situation, but transitioning them to special assets and basically telling them time to find a new lender. The banker was able to hang on, believe it or not, for as long as possible with extreme losses that they suffered, that the customer suffered in 2021 of almost $8 million, followed by losses of $2 million in 2022. But the bank had, as I say, delicately had to ask the longstanding borrower to find a new lender while still wanting to maintain the rest of the relationship. Some of the typical contractor issues that we had to resolve or overcome were a lot of progress billing, or probably 75% of their billing was progress billed, bonded jobs, and retainage. Further, as I said, we typically require personal guarantees, but there were no personal guarantees being offered because this was an ESOP. So we were faced with the situation. We liked everything that we heard. We're able to get comfortable with the transaction, and we approved a $3 million line of credit, and we were able to meet the deadline of the expiration of the bank line of credit, making sure there was no gap. The bank kept the remainder of the relationship, including all the treasury management services, which were pretty large in this situation, and it really created a winning scenario all the way around. Hopefully, as I said before, what I like to do with the case studies is kind of give you some food for thought of the capabilities and the speed in which non-bank lenders are able to provide and do so responsibly. So with that, and I know we want to be sure we save time for Q&A, what I want to do is flip to the next slide, if we could. And what this will do is we've got a QR code here, and this will take you to the landing page for the SFNet, the Secured Finance Network. And this will provide information on what we've talked about today, as well as additional information. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Rich and Dan for Q&A.
Thank you all. We've had a lot of questions coming in, so that's awesome to see. Just a few general housekeeping items. A recording of the event will be shared with all participants, all registrants. So we'll send that out as soon as we get the video uploaded. Included in that email will be questions. Will be information on our team at the Office of International Trade. We did see several SBA-specific questions as they related to individual scenarios or individual loan requests in the SBA space. We, that email and will contain information on our team, and we're here to help you with those. As we have up here on the screen, a link to the Secured Finance Network. I know that there were a number of questions related to finding out more about the industry, about the space, mentorship. And I think that'll be a great resource for those on the line today. We do have kind of first question, and I think this one, more for Yvonne. When it comes to asset-based lending in general, and just with your experience and building on, the complementary piece of non-bank lender to bank lender, just kind of curious what your experience is in terms of the areas that hold lenders back from offering ABL solutions.
So, one of the first items that we look at is, as I mentioned, availability. We'll take a look at what's the borrowing power that we can project for this particular company, and what are they asking for. So, for example, if the company feels they need a $10 million line of credit, but I quickly ask for an accounts receivable aging and their perpetual report, and I see that I could really, the assets really only generate $6 million of borrowing capacity. They think they need 10. That's obviously a mismatch. So we start to question, well, what is management seeing? And, why do they feel that they could qualify for 10? So it's usually the assets don't support what they need, Or the other thing we look at is what does their projections look like going forward for the next 12 months? And it's okay if they're not profitable per se, even though we'd like them to be, but they need to be at least EBITDA positive. So if there's a lot of depreciation and amortization that's affecting their income, we'll take that out by looking at the EBITDA line item. And if that is showing consistently negative month to month, and we don't see a way that they will get to positive, that's another reason why a bank would say, you know what, I don't think you're bankable at this moment. Maybe look at a non-bank lender, and in time, maybe you'll qualify.
Thanks, Yvonne. I think those are some great points. And, a lot of it is infrastructure, right? And I think that's actually some of the stuff that we're hoping to address here today is an understanding of the product line, understanding of the resources. And when we think about what's been in the news lately, obviously rising interest rates. So I have a question for Don and Larry on this one, but just curious what both of you have been seeing in your respective fields of field examination and the legal space on the, kind of briefly on the stress of rising rates on borrowers.
Right. So I'll start off on rising rates are impacting borrowers' ability to repay the loans. Obviously, they're most of them are having a difficulty passing on the increased cost of financing to the customers. So it's beginning to eat away their bottom lines. We're seeing, and I suspect that we'll see even more stress as rates continue to rise. It's most of these companies are so leveraged that any movement, even a 25 basis point upward tick in the interest rate, can really impede their ability to be profitable. So rising rates are going to be a problem, knowing in the near future, and I'm seeing it begin to impact companies' ability to pay the banks back and so on and so forth. So we'll have to watch this. Hopefully, we'll see stabilization here. I've been around for a long time. I've seen it in the 1990s and the 2000s, and now here we go again. But I think rates will have to stabilize to allow these banks to be able to debt service and pay their interest and principal back.
Great. Thanks, Don. Larry, what are you seeing on rising rates from your end?
We've seen some credits where, because of rising rates and the primary financial covenant that ABL borrowers have is a fixed charge covenant. And so we have seen some where they're not meeting their fixed charge because of the increased interest rates, but I haven't seen too many deals where that was enough to sort of, affect the overall performance of the company. It's usually that coupled with, continued supply chain issues, and some companies who, in reaction to the supply chain issues from 2021 and 2022, brought in more inventory that actually came in on time, so they have more inventory that they need. But most of them are working through those issues and managing it. But there are a few that are in default and are in forbearance, and we're working with them.
Thanks, Larry. We had a couple other questions, relatively technical, on the frequency. And I know Yvonne and covered this in her remarks that, it can, weekly, sometimes monthly. It really does depend on the credits. When it's a matter of what is appropriate for that borrower and their need. So that's often worked out with the lender directly. And then there was a couple questions related to accounting. And, I think for the audience as a whole, I think it's most important that we just have active and updated books that you can produce the statements that are going to be requested. I think that's kind of a foundational piece for most businesses to think about, as you get into the monitored space, as you get into larger credit lines, that you're going to need to be able to produce those statements ultimately to obtain the loan. So, with that said, I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. We're just crossing over the 2 o'clock Eastern hour. Had a great turnout. I think we had over 300 people live on the line, which is phenomenal. And then, we will be sharing this on YouTube. We'll be sharing the link, so that'll be going out to all registrants here. And please share it with anybody from your team. Find the content informative. At my office, we do love getting feedback on the events. So I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. So feel free to contact me, and we'll be looking at other educational topics related to ABL. But with that said, I wanted to pass it back to Rich to close us out and wrap up our event today.
Well, thanks, Dan. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with this audience today and for partnering with the SBA. Thanks to our panelists. And if we leave you with anything, it's just the importance, the value of this asset class, the many nuances involved in it, and that SFNet is a resource to help you understand what this asset class is all about and what it can do. So please use us as a resource, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rich. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.